COP29. The annual global conference, which is COP29, just began yesterday at Baku, the capital of Azerbaijan. And indeed, it has already begun with critical warnings from the United Nations that the Paris Agreement's goals are already in peril. As delegates gathered there for the next 10 days, COP29 has been dubbed the Finance COP due to the sharp focus on securing robust climate finance agreements, addressing the urgent needs of climate adaptation, and driving a global phase out of fossil fuels, including oil and gas, the backbones of many developed countries. This year's summit places this year's summit begins with the shadow of the US President-elect Donald Trump returning to the White House on January 20th when he would be sworn in. There is already ominous signs that he might pull the United States out of a leadership position on climate goals and indeed global climate diplomacy. He's even threatened to walk out of the UNFCCC framework. In this backdrop, in an oil-rich petrostate like Azerbaijan, the second country to be a petrostate to be hosting COP consecutively, we have a whole range of issues to discuss, particularly the operationalization of loss and damage, which is on the agenda, which was formalized at Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. And we also have the pivoting, if possible, of climate finance from the $100 billion that was pledged by developed countries in 2009 in Copenhagen to something in trillions, as India has sought and several other developing countries have sought. We must remember that even the 100 billion has not been met yet by most countries. It only crossed that threshold in 2022. Yesterday, there were also some rather, I would say, stark warnings from the World Meteorological Organization, talking about the sort of the hottest year that we've been. Chetan Bhattacharjee, who's there, a climate journalist, seasoned climate journalist, joining us from Baku, and Hindu's Jacob Koshi, who's also been tracking the climate for some time now, joining us from our Delhi offices. Chetan, thank you so much for making time again. So I'll come to you first, and I just want to tell our viewers and those who are joining us on this webinar that we do have questions that we could take in the middle and indeed at the end of this conversation. So please do keep them coming. We had quite a response yesterday, so I'm hoping that we would have the same today. Chetan, if I can toss it to you first to just give us a roundup of what has happened so far today. I understand you're an hour and a half behind, and we've had the United Nations Secretary General give his opening remarks there.
Thanks, Kunal. Good to be back. Quite a bit is happening. I think the big news last night, which was covered in the papers in India this morning, was the Article 6 creation of carbon markets, which was just pushed through yesterday. I'll come to that in a bit, but today the UN chief, he addressed the global leaders, and he essentially said that all nations just have to cut global emissions by 9% every year. A few years ago, this was something like about 7%, but since then, emissions have continued to increase. And now he says that to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees by 2030, we have to cut global emissions from fossil fuels largely by about 9% every year. And by 2030, they must fall 43%. As of now, the path that most countries are on are not in line with that 43%. They're, I think, at best, a couple of percent. The other thing that he asked for was that the emissions, or the new promises that they make to cut emissions, they must cover all emissions and the whole economy. This is going to be a major change from what has been happening in the past couple of rounds of NDCs, or nationally determined contributions. The next round of contributions, self-determined promises, if you will, are due in February. Now, one more thing quickly that he pointed out, and as he pointed out, this is the finance COP. He mentioned 5 finance elements that are critical to success. One, that a significant increase to concession of public finance. Second, a clear indication of how public finance will mobilize the trillions of dollars developing countries need. As you alluded to, at the moment, the developed countries are just about giving $100 billion, and that too, I think, only in 1 year. So there's a big finance gap. Fourth, a framework for greater accessibility, transparency, and accountability, and giving developing countries confidence that the money will materialize. And I missed out the third one, which is tapping innovative sources for raising funds. For instance, some kind of levies on shipping, on aviations. Every time you fly, there'll be some kind of green tax, and of course, fossil fuel extraction. He underlined the principle that has guided these talks forever, which is polluters must pay. The last bit was important and segues into the next aspect of Article 6, which is boosting the lending capacity for bigger and bolder multilateral development banks. And just coming to a quick wrap of what's been happening in the last 24 hours or so since we last met. Article 6 has been pushed through. What this means is the creation of a carbon market under the Paris Agreement. There are mixed reactions. I spoke with Avinash Prasad, the special advisor on climate change to the president of the Inter-American Development Bank. He's a very well-respected economist, climate economist, and he's broadly welcomed it cautiously, saying that we do need to have an international market system, but there needs to be some improvement in this. Activists have said that this move helps big oil, and I'm sure Jacob can add a lot more, but this is broadly what's been happening over here in Baku.
Right. Thank you so much, Chetan, for that overview. And Jacob, we've been speaking about this before, and you've in fact just filed a sort of an analysis of the coming through of the carbon markets, which has been going on for years now at COP29. And in your analysis, you point to quite a few niggles, as you've called it. How, for one, how does one determine which country is to be considered for the carbon credits when it's, say, sequestered in a country but funded by another company in another country, and so on and so forth. Of course, as Chetan also pointed out, there have been controversies. There are several activist groups that have called this to be a sort of a handout for oil-rich nations to continue to do what they do. So broadly, what does this mean, carbon markets in general, for our viewers? I think it's something that we must sort of frame in simple language. And secondly, how would it help developing nations?
Thanks, Kunal, for it's a great joining Chetan and you over here. So very simply, Article 6, or Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, that is always been considered the most complex aspect of all conversation around carbon emissions and dealing with climate, and that's because it deals with carbon markets, and carbon markets have been around actually for a very long time. Since 2008, you had the Kyoto Protocol, which also allowed countries to trade emissions. So put very simply, it is that developing countries or countries that were not obliged to undertake emissions themselves, they were allowed to, rather than pursue a fossil-driven energy source to power their industries or power their facilities, they would be incentivized in some ways by developed countries, in setting up an alternate fuel source which is clean and non-fossil based. The argument was that all of the
go ahead. We might have just lost you for a second, but yeah, you're back. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
The argument
was that incentivizing a developing country, a facility in a developing country this way would generate some carbon reductions. I mean, some emissions would have been prevented from going into the atmosphere, and every ton of this would be considered a carbon credit, so to say, and those credits would be lodged with the financing country or the one in the developed in the developed world, and because they already have national obligations to meet certain targets, they could either either they could pay for carbon credits, or finance pathways that would take them away from using fossil fuel themselves. The whole purpose is that market mechanisms would actually determine the price of carbon, and companies would always have to take the call on whether it is worth just buying credits from somewhere or taking up clean action themselves. The argument was that at some point carbon credits would be too expensive, and with the compliance requirements becoming stricter every year, and they would be less incentivized. They would be less incentivized to simply just buy credits of developing countries, and so on and so forth. Now, what we saw in 2008, 2009, and subsequently, this didn't really quite work for a while, because it became extremely difficult to verify whether projects implemented in several countries were actually delivering on cutting emissions. So many carbon markets went on a cold storage for some time, but with but now the conversation has largely changed, because when the Kyoto markets were set up, there was the distinction between annex countries and non-annex countries. That is, developed versus developing, but developing countries had no obligations at all. But since Paris, the general agreement has been that every country, developing or not, has to do its bit for curtailing carbon emissions, and that's how we have this whole concept of the NDCs, or nationally determined contributions. It's voluntary, but it is a sort of enforceable cap. And with the cost of compliance, cost of investing in technologies, investing in solar, renewable, they are determined by market forces. It is getting expensive, and it is now believed again that unless you have viable market mechanisms, it is very difficult to get fund flows from the developed countries into developing countries, which is why for a long time you've had carbon markets back in the system. But the old problems have always surfaced. Who's going to verify this? Who's going to ensure that the credits that are generated in one place actually have translated into meaningful reductions? But since 2022, there has been a sort of broad agreement on the rules. There have been the niggles that you mentioned were essentially these. What of banking, so to say, which is that, let's say there is a renewable energy project in a developing country, or let's say a forestation. Somebody has planted hectares and hectares of forest to sequester carbon. Now, at some point, there is certainly reductions of carbon that might translate at some point. But in whose credit will those saved reductions go? Will it be the developed country that invested in the forestation, or will it be the country where it is, where such projects are located? So, and there's a whole slew of emerging technologies per se that are coming up. Then there's a complexity of voluntary carbon market, which is just company-based. Companies just saying, "Hey, I'm going to plant 1,000 hectares of worth forest to save degraded land somewhere," and that is just purely going to be for showing up in my CSR accounts. And this is outside any kind of national accounting. So many of these questions are still not there. But the breakthrough last night was that countries kind of agreed that yes, we can have a global carbon market. But what they call methodologies and accounting, they have basically given the green signal for methodologies and accounting to go ahead. This is not going to be determined in the next 2 weeks, and you're going to see more, but it's more like backroom work. I would say, just like in Indian Parliament, a bill has been passed by all the houses, but they generally leave the rules, the framing of the rules, for later. So I think that's the closest analogy to what has happened since last night.
Right. So, that's a really sort of broad sweep that you've given us, particularly taking it all the way back to the Kyoto Protocol and how the evolution of the carbon markets. But many would say that you sort of pointed this out in your you sort of reflected on this, I suppose. Many would say that it is a sort of a cop out by rich countries to actually pump in the money which they ought to be doing because they have been the historical emitters, and
Yes.
and instead of doing that, they are sort of what shall I say? Passing the baton on to the markets as if the markets could deliver on what they ought to be doing. How does one sort of, yeah, how do you look at it, and how are people looking at it given that this is now materialized?
Well, right from Kyoto times, there was always suspicion that markets will not work. I mean, the markets clearly aren't working the way as they should be in terms of ensuring that overall greenhouse gas emissions are going low. And it's 2024 now, and even as Chetan pointed out, the
They sort of
emissions are just
frozen
on the
again.
rise. Emissions are continuously on a rise. Am I audible?
Yeah, you froze for a second again, but yeah,
Okay.
greenhouse gas emissions are continuously on the rise. Yeah.
On the rise. So, what other system do we have? I mean, we have. It's clearly not happened. I mean, we've conceived of all kinds of things like loss and damage fund, and you know, the whole argument that developed countries who are scientifically proven to have been responsible for the bulk of the existing
Right.
carbon concentration in the world. I mean, they're not guilt. They're not facing any kind of moral, catharsis, or they are guilt tripping enough to, transfer funds for adaptation or mitigation to the developing country.
Clearly, yes, that's right. Yeah.
And what's happened essentially is, I mean, there is, of course, a huge uptake of renewable energy. I mean, from 2008 to 2024, the rise in adoption of solar energy has been exponential. I mean,
Yeah.
things like, for example, even things like offshore wind farms, which were like science fiction, feasible, but still science fiction in terms of practicality, are now a reality,
A reality,
including
that's right.
India.
Yeah.
So, and so the argument is that it is only business, it is only make it good old traditional business practices that is actually going to push any kind of uh, is going to actually induce developing countries to to not set up new coal plants, or invest in new fossil bearing capacities, but and
Yeah.
developed countries say that we will invest in renewable energy projects wherever it be, only if there is a return on investment for this. And markets seem to be the only way. I mean, like, I guess for every, coming down to every other aspect of a life, it seems to be that only markets seem to be the justify the agreed. In fact, the whole ends the new collective quantified goal that is actually
Yeah. Right. The new one. Yeah.
the big star
Yeah.
of COP29. I mean, many analysts that I've spoken to say that it's carbon markets that actually are best placed to to even deliver on goals like
On those goals.
NCG.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So that's a good segue for me to go back to Chetan. NC new national. What did you say that again? It's a convoluted
Yeah.
acronym,
A new
and
collective,
new collective
quantifiable,
quantifiable. Yeah.
quantifiable
So
goal. I think that's the one.
Yes,
that's
that's
right.
one.
Yeah. That's the one. So, and it's supposed to be a pivot, from this 100 billion that we've been speaking about, which has already not been delivered. And again, we must remember that this is almost every COP presidentship wants to sort of claim a certain outcome, right? Like for Chetan, you and I were talking about how health was a COP 28 outcome, or a Dubai COP outcome, and so is this going to be a Baku COP outcome, or and also are they already sort of feeling, is there already talk that, look, we've already delivered on the carbon markets, right? Like, so this is not quite a washout, because that's been a big sort of the shadow that's been following. Many world leaders have not come there. The Prime Minister of India, of course, is not there. The Chinese Premier is not there. The US President's not there. Many of the world leaders who ought to be at the decision-making table are actually not there in Baku. So, how do you see this playing out there in the negotiations?
So I think the NCQG, if I've got the acronym right, I think first thing is that they should simplify this. But anyway, jokes aside, the first thing that it is a requirement that they need to push this through this time because it rolls out next year. How it will take shape is anybody's guess. It'll require very hard negotiations, as Jacob and you have also pointed out. It effectively means developed nations coughing up a lot more money. Nobody is at the moment in a political space or economic space to give those additional billions of dollars. There are people, experts like Mr. Prasad, who have recommended some kind of midway path. So that is the overarching main climate fund, climate finance mechanism that has to be pushed through. In comparison, the carbon market, the Article 6 development seems to be somewhat of a lower hanging fruit. And I think it will take some time for all the nitty-gritties to be worked out. But I think that will happen. I think it is a pretty big, significant step that one stumbling block for the last several COPs has been accomplished. Does that mean if one has been accomplished, a lot of the other stumbling blocks will be accomplished? It's not very clear. The other thing that is required, and it's very hard to get a sense of it, is will all the countries, not just the rich countries, will they all step up their NDCs, their promises on how they're going to cut emissions over the next few years? Time is running out, and emissions are rising, the temperatures are rising. So all eyes on the NDCs and the new finance mechanism.
Right. Okay, so I'll just pause there for a minute before we go back to questions. I just wondered from our backroom team if we've gotten any comments or questions from audiences, since we sort of have this as a format, a question, interactive format. If we do, we can take them on. So let's just, for a quick moment, check what they are. All right, no questions yet. I think just some general comments. Dinesh says, I think reducing the carbon footprint by every individual may improve climate changes. Indeed, that's a thought that has been there with several people who advocate for personal responsibility for their own carbon footprint. But usually these conversations are at the macro level in when they take place annually. Chetan, there was something that we did touch upon. We wanted to talk about. We've kept it for another conversation, but maybe we can just begin today. Health has been an issue, particularly with extreme weather. There's, I believe, the WHO's Director General is expected to speak at some point. I don't know if it is today or tomorrow. You can, update us on that. Are we expecting any further movement on any sort of tackling health emergencies and health-related issues that might emerge from climate change at this COP?
Good point. I think let me start by saying if you compare this COP to the last COP in Dubai had a lot more talk about health, and they had a health day. They had also some health declarations. What that does, it may not achieve much concrete action on the ground, but what it does is provoke or trigger various governments to action and organizations to commit to climate action on health. Today, the UN chief actually said he marked out children. The UNICEF also spoke out about how climate change is affecting children. The WHO officials, top officials have also mentioned that all today. And what they're trying to do is get all negotiators, all the global leaders to accept that the climate change crisis, the global warming crisis, is a health crisis. So, for instance, the UN chief said children are going to bed hungry as droughts ravage crops. Why is that? Increasing heat will lead to more droughts, which will mean that there will be less food available. The UNICEF pointed out that children under the age of 1, they triple their weight by the time they turn 1, and they need more nutrients. in case of global warming, what will happen is that those nutrients will be harder to come by. Excess heat also is a high risk of premature babies and deformities. The problems start at the fetus stage and they carry on till at least the adolescent stage. And this is just for children. It becomes worse for adults also in terms of heat exposure, and droughts and health effects of air pollution can kill something like, I think they've estimated 7 million premature deaths. So there's a whole list of ways that climate change affects us on a daily basis and millions of people. And they want negotiators to put this on the table when they're discussing this. The reality is that not many have actually spoken about health at the main stage.
Right, right, right. So, I mean, that's a staggering number, 7 million people who might be affected, who could be affected. And of course, health is an insidious issue in climate conversations, much like how I think energy is an insidious issue. We sort of, it's apparent, but we don't quite see it the way, for instance, when we find it on in transport in other areas. I think Jacob has been having some difficulty with his connection as well, and we're almost out of time. So I think I will let you go, Chetan, and for the rest of the time, which is how many more hours do you have there for the close of negotiations, or however long?
About 10 days more, yeah.
Yeah, 10 days more, and you're there till the end of Thursday, Friday.
Yeah, till the end of this week.
Excellent. So we would be, I'm sure, getting some more updates from you as negotiations go on. But that's it from me, Kunal Shankar at the Hindu, and Chetan at Baku in Azerbaijan, and Jacob Koshi, who is in New Delhi. For more on any climate-related news from Baku at COP29, do follow The Hindu on all your social media platforms, and also follow us at the daily tracker of COP29. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Kunal.
Thank you.